The waiting room at Riverside Medical Center buzzed with the usual morning activity. Sarah Martinez adjusted her position in the uncomfortable plastic chair, trying to find a spot that didn't aggravate the persistent ache in her lower back. She had been putting off this routine checkup for months, but her supervisor at the construction company had finally insisted after she'd missed 3 days last week due to what she'd called a stomach bug. The truth was more complicated than that. Sarah had learned long ago that explaining the real reasons behind her occasional absences only led to uncomfortable questions and pitying looks she couldn't stomach. At 28, she had become an expert at crafting believable excuses for the days when her body simply refused to cooperate, when old injuries flared up like angry ghosts from a past she was trying to forget. She picked up a magazine from the side table, its pages already dog-eared from countless anxious hands. The cover promised 10 ways to find inner peace in bold, cheerful letters that seemed to mock her current state of mind. Sarah had tried most self-help strategies over the years, from meditation apps to therapy sessions that left her feeling more exposed than healed. Nothing seemed to quiet the restless energy that lived just beneath her skin, the constant awareness that danger could lurk around any corner. Sarah Martinez? A young nurse with kind eyes appeared at the reception desk, clipboard in hand. Dr. Peterson will see you now. Sarah stood, automatically scanning the room as she always did. 3 exits, 2 windows, 7 other patients who seemed absorbed in their own concerns. The assessment was unconscious now, a habit formed during months when such awareness had meant the difference between safety and something far worse. Dr. Peterson's office was exactly what she expected from a small-town medical practice. Diplomas hung in neat rows on cream-colored walls, and a desk cluttered with patient files suggested a physician who cared more about his work than appearances. The doctor himself was probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the slightly rumpled look of someone who had been seeing patients since dawn. Ms. Martinez, good to see you again, he said, though Sarah was fairly certain this was only their second meeting. How have you been feeling since your last visit? Fine, mostly, Sarah replied, settling into the examination chair. Just some ongoing back issues and the occasional headache. Nothing too serious. Dr. Peterson nodded, making notes in her file. Any changes in your sleep patterns? Energy levels? How about your appetite? The questions were routine, but Sarah found herself hesitating before each answer. How could she explain that she rarely slept more than 4 hours at a stretch, that she positioned her bed so she could see both the door and the window, that she kept a baseball bat within arm's reach despite living in one of the safest neighborhoods in town? Sleep could be better, she admitted. And I've been having some digestive issues lately. What she didn't mention was the way her stomach clenched whenever she heard unexpected footsteps in the hallway of her apartment building, or how certain sounds, a car backfiring, a door slamming too hard, could send her heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with her current, peaceful life. Dr. Peterson continued his examination, checking her blood pressure and listening to her heart and lungs. When he asked her to remove her shirt for a more thorough examination, Sarah felt the familiar spike of anxiety. She had worn a long-sleeved shirt specifically to avoid this moment, but there was no way around it now. I'll need to listen to your breathing from the back as well, Dr. Peterson said, his tone professional and matter-of-fact. Sarah turned around and lifted her shirt, exposing her back to the cool air of the examination room. She heard Dr. Peterson's sharp intake of breath and knew he had seen what she had hoped to keep hidden. The scars were old now, silver-white lines that crisscrossed her shoulder blades and traced down her spine like a roadmap of violence. Some were thin and precise, others jagged and angry-looking even after all this time. Each one told a story she had never shared with anyone, memories locked away so tightly that sometimes she could almost pretend they belonged to someone else. Ms. Martinez, Dr. Peterson said quietly, his voice careful and controlled. These appear to be old injuries. Have you discussed them with a physician before? Sarah pulled her shirt back down and turned to face him, her expression carefully neutral. They're from an accident years ago. Nothing that affects my current health. It wasn't technically a lie. She had learned to be creative with the truth, to find ways of describing her experiences that didn't invite follow-up questions or concerned looks. An accident was easier to explain than the reality of what had happened in that basement room, during those months when she had begun to believe that darkness was all the world had to offer. Dr. Peterson made a note in her file, but Sarah could see the questions in his eyes. In her experience, medical professionals fell into two categories: those who accepted her vague explanations and moved on, and those who pushed for details she wasn't prepared to give. She hoped Dr. Peterson would prove to be the former. "I'd like to schedule you for some blood work," he said finally. "And perhaps we should discuss some options for managing your sleep issues and back pain. There are some new approaches that might help." Sarah nodded, already planning how she could delay or avoid the follow-up appointments. She had become skilled at managing her own symptoms over the years, using a combination of over-the-counter medications, careful stretching routines, and sheer willpower to function in her daily life. As Dr. Peterson walked her to the reception desk to schedule her blood work, Sarah noticed a commotion near the main entrance. A tall man in his 30s had just walked in, supporting an elderly woman who appeared to be in considerable pain. The man moved with a particular kind of alertness that Sarah recognized immediately, the fluid, efficient movements of someone trained for combat. Their eyes met across the waiting room, and Sarah felt something shift in the air between them. The man's gaze lingered on her face for just a moment too long, and she saw a flicker of recognition there that had nothing to do with having met before. It was the look of one survivor recognizing another, a silent acknowledgement that passed between people who had seen things that couldn't be easily explained to those who lived in safer worlds. The moment passed quickly, and the man turned his attention back to the elderly woman, helping her to the reception desk with gentle efficiency. But Sarah found herself watching him from the corner of her eye as she scheduled her appointment, noting the way he scanned the room, the careful way he positioned himself so he could see all the exits. "Mrs. Chen, let's get you seen right away," the receptionist said, and the man helped the elderly woman toward the examination rooms. As they passed Sarah, she caught a glimpse of his left hand and the distinctive scars that marked his knuckles, the kind that came from training and combat, not accidents or mishaps. Sarah finished her appointment scheduling and headed for the exit, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just happened. In her carefully ordered life, she had learned to avoid complications and unexpected connections. She had built her world small and manageable, with clear boundaries and predictable routines that helped her maintain the illusion of control. But, as she walked to her car, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the stranger's eyes and the way he had moved through the medical center like someone who understood that safety was always temporary, that vigilance was the price of peace. For the first time in years, she had encountered someone who might understand the weight she carried, the reasons behind her constant alertness. The drive back to her apartment took her through the familiar streets of her adopted hometown. She had chosen this place specifically for its quiet neighborhoods and low crime rates, for the way people minded their own business and didn't ask too many questions about newcomers with spotty employment histories and reluctance to discuss their pasts. Sarah had been living here for 3 years now, long enough to establish routines and build a carefully constructed life that looked normal from the outside. She worked construction, a job that appreciated her strength and attention to detail while requiring minimal social interaction. Her co-workers respected her competence and didn't pry into her personal life, especially after she had demonstrated her ability to handle both the physical demands of the work and the occasional difficult personalities that came with the territory. Her apartment was a studio on the 3rd floor of a converted house, chosen for its single entrance, good sightlines, and the elderly landlord who appreciated quiet tenants who paid their rent on time. Sarah had furnished it with pieces from thrift stores and garage sales, creating a space that was comfortable without being too personal, the kind of place she could leave quickly if necessary without feeling like she was abandoning a life she cared about. But, lately, she had begun to wonder if her careful isolation was as protective as she had once believed. The loneliness was starting to feel less like safety and more like another kind of prison, one she had built for herself with walls just as solid as any she had escaped from. As Sarah climbed the stairs to her apartment, she found herself thinking again about the stranger at the medical center. There had been something in his eyes that suggested he might understand the particular exhaustion that came from always being ready for the worst to happen, the way hypervigilance could become as much a part of daily life as breathing. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, automatically checking the small pieces of tape she had placed on the windows to ensure no one had entered while she was gone. Everything was exactly as she had left it, but, for once, the confirmation of her security didn't bring its usual sense of relief. Instead, Sarah found herself wondering what it might be like to trust someone enough to share the truth about her scars, to have a conversation that didn't require careful editing and strategic omissions. The thought was both terrifying and oddly appealing, like considering a jump from a very high place, dangerous but potentially liberating. She made herself a simple lunch and sat at her small table, looking out the window at the quiet street below. Tomorrow, she would go back to work, back to the familiar rhythms of her constructed life. But something had shifted during that brief encounter in the medical center, a recognition that had awakened possibilities she had thought were permanently closed to her. For the first time in years, Sarah found herself curious about someone else, wondering about the story behind the stranger's scars and whether he had found ways to carry his past that didn't require such complete isolation. The question scared her, but it also felt like the first stirring of something that might, eventually, resemble hope. Marcus Chen had been visiting his grandmother every Tuesday for the past 6 months, ever since her hip replacement surgery had left her struggling with mobility issues that her fierce independence refused to acknowledge. At 78, Grandma Chen maintained that she was perfectly capable of managing her own medical appointments, household tasks, and general life administration. The reality was more complicated, but Marcus had learned to frame his assistance as casual visits rather than necessary support, preserving her dignity while ensuring she received the care she needed. This particular Tuesday had started like all the others, with Marcus arriving at her small house to find her dressed and ready to go, her purse clutched in arthritic hands that she insisted were just a little stiff from the weather. The drive to Riverside Medical Center had been filled with her usual commentary on the changing neighborhood, the state of modern drivers, and her concerns about Dr. Peterson's tendency to prescribe medications for problems she believed could be solved with proper nutrition and adequate rest. These doctors today, she had said, adjusting her seatbelt with careful precision, they want to give you a pill for everything. In my day, we handled our problems with common sense and hard work. Marcus had nodded and made appropriate responses, but his mind was partially elsewhere, running through the mental checklist that had become second nature during his 8 years as a Navy SEAL. Even in civilian settings, he automatically noted traffic patterns, potential escape routes, and unusual activity that might signal developing problems. The habit had been essential during his military service, and, despite being officially retired for 2 years, he found it impossible to completely turn off. The transition to civilian life had been more challenging than he had anticipated when he first made the decision to leave active duty. The skills that had made him exceptionally good at his military job, hypervigilance, quick threat assessment, physical readiness for combat, were less useful in everyday situations. Marcus had discovered that the qualities that made someone an effective special operations soldier could sometimes work against them in civilian relationships and normal social interactions. He had tried therapy through the VA, participated in transition programs designed to help veterans adjust to civilian life, and even attempted a few relationships with women who seemed genuinely interested in understanding his background. But explaining the psychological aftermath of his service often proved more complicated than simply dealing with the symptoms on his own. Most people wanted simple stories about heroism and clear-cut victories, not the messy reality of moral ambiguity and the permanent changes that came from years of operating in hostile environments. The medical center parking lot was busier than usual, and Marcus had to circle twice before finding a space that satisfied his unconscious security requirements, close enough to the building for quick access, positioned so the car couldn't be blocked in, with clear sightlines to the surrounding area. His grandmother hadn't commented on his particular parking habits, though he suspected she had noticed his preferences over their months of appointments together. Inside the medical center, Marcus had immediately begun his standard environmental assessment. 2 security cameras visible from the entrance, 1 guard at the reception desk who appeared to be unarmed, multiple exit routes including emergency stairs that he had noted during previous visits. The waiting area was populated with the usual mix of patients, elderly individuals with routine appointments, parents with small children, and a few people who looked like they were dealing with more serious health concerns. It was during this automatic scan of the room that Marcus had noticed her. The woman was probably in her late 20s, with shoulder-length dark hair and the kind of posture that suggested someone who was accustomed to physical work. But it was something else that caught his attention, the way she positioned herself in her chair, the subtle but constant awareness of her surroundings, the controlled breathing pattern he recognized from his own stress management techniques. When their eyes met across the waiting room, Marcus felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with having seen her before. In her carefully neutral expression, He saw something he knew intimately, the look of someone who had learned to hide significant pain behind a facade of normalcy. The woman's eyes held the particular kind of alertness that came from experience with genuine danger, not the general anxiety that many people experienced in medical settings. The moment had lasted only a few seconds, but Marcus found himself thinking about it even as he helped his grandmother navigate the check-in process and settle into a chair near the reception desk. There had been something about the woman's bearing that suggested military or law enforcement experience, but also a quality he couldn't quite identify, a guardedness that seemed more personal than professional. "Marcus, stop fidgeting and sit down," his grandmother said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had raised 6 children and numerous grandchildren. "Dr. Peterson will see us when he's ready." Marcus sat in the chair beside her, but he couldn't completely stop his visual monitoring of the waiting room. The woman was still there, apparently waiting for her own appointment, and he noticed that she had chosen her seat with the same strategic awareness he would have used, back to the wall, clear view of all entrances, positioned for quick movement if necessary. "Mrs. Chen?" A nurse appeared at the reception desk, and Marcus helped his grandmother to her feet, supporting her arm as they followed the nurse toward the examination rooms. As they passed the woman's chair, Marcus caught a glimpse of her hands and noticed the slight calluses that suggested construction or manual labor work. There was also something about the way she held herself that reminded him of some of the female soldiers he had served with, competent, alert, and carrying themselves like people who had learned not to depend on others for their safety. The examination with Dr. Peterson went smoothly, though Marcus could tell his grandmother was downplaying some of her symptoms. Her hip was healing well from the replacement surgery, but she was still experiencing more pain and mobility limitations than she wanted to admit. Dr. Peterson adjusted her medication schedule and recommended some additional physical therapy, suggestions that Marcus knew his grandmother would accept reluctantly and follow only partially. "She's doing very well for someone her age," Dr. Peterson told Marcus privately while his grandmother was getting dressed. "But I'm concerned about her living alone. Has she considered any assisted living options?" Marcus nodded, though he knew that particular conversation would require careful timing and diplomatic handling. His grandmother's independence was fiercely important to her, and any suggestion that she needed help with daily activities would need to be presented as temporary assistance rather than permanent lifestyle changes. They were finishing up the appointment paperwork when Marcus heard raised voices from the waiting area. Through the partially open door of the examination room, he could see a man in his 40s arguing with the receptionist about appointment scheduling. The man's body language suggested escalating frustration, and his voice was getting loud enough to disturb other patients. Marcus's training kicked in automatically. He assessed the situation quickly. The man appeared to be unarmed but was becoming increasingly agitated. The receptionist looked uncomfortable and out of her depth, and several patients in the waiting area were starting to look nervous. The security guard was approaching the situation, but he was elderly and didn't seem equipped to handle a potentially violent confrontation. "Grandma, wait here for just a minute," Marcus said quietly, helping her to a chair in the hallway outside the examination room. "I'll be right back." He moved toward the waiting area with the same calm efficiency he had used countless times during his military service. The key to de-escalating situations like this was to project calm authority while offering the agitated person a way to save face and resolve their problem without confrontation. "Excuse me," Marcus said, approaching the man at the reception desk. His voice was steady and non-threatening, but carried enough authority to command attention. "Is there something I can help you with?" The man turned toward Marcus, his face flushed with anger. "This is none of your business. I'm trying to get an appointment for my wife, and they're telling me I have to wait 3 weeks for a routine checkup." Marcus nodded, keeping his expression neutral and sympathetic. "That does sound frustrating. Medical scheduling can be really challenging." He glanced at the receptionist, who looked grateful for the intervention. "Have you explained to them that this is urgent?" The simple act of acknowledging the man's frustration and offering to help find a solution seemed to diffuse some of his anger. Marcus had learned during his military service that most confrontational situations involved people who felt unheard or disrespected, and often could be resolved by demonstrating that someone was taking their concerns seriously. While Marcus was helping to resolve the situation at the reception desk, he noticed that the woman he had observed earlier was watching the interaction with the same professional assessment he was making. When the agitated man finally accepted a cancellation list appointment and left the medical center, Marcus caught the woman's eye again, and she gave him a small nod that suggested approval of his handling of the situation. After ensuring that the waiting room had returned to its normal calm atmosphere, Marcus went back to collect his grandmother, who had observed the entire interaction with interest. "You handled that well," she said as they walked toward the exit. "That man was getting ready to cause real trouble." Marcus helped her into the car, thinking about the brief encounter and the way the woman in the waiting room had observed his intervention. There had been something in her expression that suggested she understood exactly what he had been doing and why it had been necessary. In his experience, most civilians either didn't notice developing confrontations or weren't sure how to respond when they did recognize them. The woman's awareness suggested either professional experience with conflict situations or personal reasons for being hypervigilant about potential violence. The drive back to his grandmother's house was quiet, with both of them lost in their own thoughts. Marcus found himself wondering about the woman at the medical center, who she was, what her story might be, and whether his impression of her as someone with hidden depths was accurate or just projection based on his own experiences. His grandmother's house was a small ranch-style home in an older neighborhood where she had lived for 40 years. Marcus helped her inside and made sure she was settled comfortably with her medications and something to eat before beginning his usual security check of the house. He tested the locks on all doors and windows, replaced a burnt-out light bulb in the back porch fixture, and programmed the new pharmacy phone number into her emergency contact list. "You don't need to fuss over me so much," his grandmother said, but her tone was affectionate rather than annoyed. "I've been taking care of myself longer than you've been alive." Marcus smiled and kissed her forehead before leaving. The drive back to his own apartment gave him time to think about the morning's events and the strange sense of connection he had felt with a complete stranger. In the 2 years since leaving the Navy, Marcus had become accustomed to feeling like he was operating in a world where most people couldn't understand his background or the way his experiences had shaped his perspective. The woman at the medical center had been different somehow. There had been a recognition in her eyes that suggested she might understand what it was like to carry invisible scars, to navigate everyday situations while remaining constantly aware of potential threats. The possibility of meeting someone who truly understood that particular burden was both appealing and terrifying. Marcus had tried dating since his return to civilian life, but explaining his background and its ongoing effects had proven consistently challenging. Most people either romanticized his military service in ways that made him uncomfortable, or they were intimidated by aspects of his experience that he couldn't completely hide. The few relationships he had attempted had ended when the women involved realized that his hypervigilance and emotional guardedness weren't temporary adjustments but permanent changes that would require understanding and accommodation. Back in his own apartment, Marcus went through his evening routine, which included checking his security system, reviewing the day's news for any developments that might affect regional stability, and spending an hour in physical training to maintain the conditioning that had become essential to his mental health. The structured routine helped him manage the restless energy that was a constant companion, the feeling that he should be doing something more important than civilian daily life. But, tonight, his usual routine felt less satisfying than normal. The brief encounter at the medical center had awakened something he had thought was permanently dormant: curiosity about another person, interest in connecting with someone who might understand his reality without requiring extensive explanation or adjustment. As he settled in for the night, Marcus found himself hoping that he would see the woman again, perhaps during one of his future visits with his grandmother. The thought of having a conversation with someone who might truly understand his perspective was both exciting and nerve-wracking. He had become so accustomed to emotional isolation that the possibility of genuine connection felt like considering a mission into unfamiliar territory, potentially rewarding but definitely dangerous. For the first time in months, Marcus fell asleep thinking about possibilities rather than problems, wondering whether two people carrying similar invisible wounds might find in each other the understanding that neither had been able to find anywhere else. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's appointment at Riverside Medical Center, and she found herself thinking about the stranger more often than she cared to admit. The blood work Dr. Peterson had ordered came back mostly normal, with only slightly elevated stress markers that he attributed to her demanding physical job and recommended she try to find better work-life balance. Sarah had nodded and made appropriate responses, all while thinking that if only managing stress were as simple as working fewer hours. She had been avoiding scheduling the follow-up appointment Dr. Peterson wanted, using the excuse of a busy work schedule to postpone dealing with his concerned questions about her scars. The construction project she was working on, a new office building downtown, had been consuming most of her time and energy, which was exactly how she preferred it. Physical labor had always been therapeutic for her, a way to channel nervous energy into something productive while avoiding the kind of interpersonal complications that came with office jobs. Her co-workers on the construction crew were a mixed group of experienced tradespeople who appreciated competence and didn't ask personal questions. Sarah had earned their respect over the months by demonstrating that she could handle heavy lifting, work in uncomfortable conditions, and solve problems independently. The job site was loud, busy, and focused on practical tasks that left little room for the kind of casual conversation that might lead to uncomfortable territory. But even the demanding physical work hadn't been enough to completely distract her from thinking about the man she had seen at the medical center. There had been something about his controlled movements and alert awareness that suggested military background, and the brief moment when their eyes met had felt like recognition between people who shared similar experiences with situations most people never encountered. Sarah had been telling herself for years that she preferred isolation, that the carefully controlled boundaries of her life were protection rather than limitation. But, lately, she had begun to question whether her determination to avoid connections was serving her well or simply ensuring that she remained permanently stuck in survival mode. The realization had come during a particularly difficult night when old nightmares had returned with enough intensity to leave her awake until dawn, sitting in her kitchen with a cup of coffee and wondering if she would spend the rest of her life jumping at unexpected sounds and sleeping with weapons within reach. The thought of decades more of such isolation had felt less like safety and more like a different kind of prison sentence. It was Thursday morning when Sarah received an unexpected call from Dr. Peterson's office. The receptionist explained that they had a cancellation in their schedule and wondered if Sarah would like to come in that afternoon for her follow-up appointment rather than waiting until the following week. Sarah's first instinct was to decline, to maintain the protective distance she had worked so hard to establish. But something made her pause before answering. Maybe it was curiosity about whether she might see the stranger again, or perhaps a growing recognition that avoiding medical care wasn't a sustainable long-term strategy for someone whose past had left lasting physical effects. "I can be there at 2:30, she heard herself saying, surprising herself with the decision. The afternoon was unusually warm for early spring, and Sarah arrived at the medical center a few minutes early, using the extra time to sit in her car and prepare herself mentally for another round of careful answers to Dr. Peterson's questions. She had practiced responses that would satisfy his medical concerns without revealing details she wasn't ready to share, a skill she had developed over years of managing interactions with people who needed information she couldn't provide. The waiting room was less crowded than it had been during her previous visit, with only a few patients scattered across the available seating. Sarah chose her usual strategic position and settled in with a magazine, trying to project the appearance of someone who was simply killing time before a routine appointment. She was reading an article about home renovation projects when she heard familiar voices near the reception desk. Looking up, she saw the same elderly woman from her previous visit, accompanied by the same tall man who had caught her attention. Today, the elderly woman appeared to be moving more easily, though she still leaned slightly on the man's arm for support. "Mrs. Chen, we'll get you checked in right away," the receptionist said warmly, clearly recognizing regular patients. "Dr. Peterson is running a little behind schedule, but it shouldn't be more than 15 minutes. The man, Marcus, Sarah remembered hearing someone call him, helped his grandmother to a seat and sat down beside her. Sarah noticed that he chose his position with the same tactical awareness she employed, placing himself where he could see all the entrances while keeping his grandmother within easy reach. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, Marcus occasionally checking his phone while his grandmother flipped through a magazine about gardening. Sarah found herself observing them from her peripheral vision, noting the easy affection between them and the way Marcus remained alert to his surroundings without seeming anxious or paranoid. It was during this quiet observation that the situation in the waiting room suddenly changed. A middle-aged woman near the reception desk began showing signs of medical distress, clutching her chest and breathing heavily. Within seconds, the calm atmosphere had transformed into controlled chaos as the receptionist called for medical assistance and other patients began to react with varying degrees of alarm. Sarah watched as Marcus immediately stood and moved toward the woman in distress, his movements smooth and purposeful. He knelt beside her chair and began speaking in calm, reassuring tones while quickly assessing her condition. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from experience with emergency situations, and Sarah could see him subtly checking the woman's pulse and breathing while keeping her calm. "Ma'am, my name is Marcus. I'm going to stay right here with you until the doctor arrives. Can you tell me your name?" His voice was steady and professional, the kind of tone that could cut through panic and focus someone's attention. The woman nodded weakly and whispered her name. Marcus continued talking to her, asking simple questions that seemed designed to keep her conscious and alert while monitoring her vital signs with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, Dr. Peterson and a nurse had appeared to take over the medical emergency, but Marcus remained nearby until they had the situation completely under control. Sarah had watched the entire interaction with professional appreciation. Marcus's response had been textbook emergency first aid, executed with the kind of calm competence that suggested extensive training. But what impressed her even more was the way he had transitioned seamlessly from emergency responder back to concerned grandson, returning to his grandmother's side and reassuring her that everything was under control. "That young man knows what he's doing," Mrs. Chen said to the receptionist, her voice carrying obvious pride. "He was in the Navy for 8 years. Special Forces." The confirmation of Sarah's suspicions about Marcus's military background came with a jolt of recognition. Special Forces training would explain his alertness, his smooth responses to crisis situations, and the particular way he carried himself. It might also explain the controlled guardedness she had noticed in his expression, the sense that he was someone who understood that safety was always temporary and vigilance was essential. When Sarah's name was called for her appointment, she had to walk past Marcus and his grandmother on her way to the examination rooms. As she passed their chairs, Marcus looked up and their eyes met again. This time, the moment of connection lasted longer, and Sarah saw something in his expression that suggested he had been thinking about their previous encounter as much as she had. "Sarah Martinez," he said quietly, reading her name from the nurse's clipboard. "I'm Marcus Chen." The simple introduction felt like a significant step, acknowledging the mutual awareness that had been building between them. Sarah nodded and offered a small smile before following the nurse to the examination room, but the brief exchange left her feeling more unsettled than she wanted to admit. Dr. Peterson's examination was routine, focused primarily on her blood work results and questions about her ongoing symptoms. Sarah managed to deflect most of his inquiries about her scars with vague references to old injuries, though she could tell he remained concerned about some aspects of her medical history that didn't quite add up. "Your stress markers are still elevated," Dr. Peterson said, making notes in her file. "Have you considered talking to someone about stress management techniques? Sometimes counseling can be helpful for people dealing with chronic pain or difficult life transitions." Sarah nodded noncommittally, knowing that she would never follow up on the suggestion. The idea of explaining her background to a therapist, of revisiting memories she had worked so hard to contain, felt more threatening than helpful. She had learned to manage her symptoms through careful routine and strict emotional control, and the thought of disrupting that fragile stability was terrifying. When she finished her appointment and returned to the waiting room, Marcus and his grandmother were still there, apparently waiting for their turn with Dr. Peterson. Sarah hesitated near the reception desk, unsure whether to simply leave or attempt some kind of interaction with Marcus. The decision was made for her when Mrs. Chen looked up from her magazine and smiled. "You're the young lady who was here a few weeks ago," Mrs. Chen said warmly. "I remember seeing you when that man was causing trouble at the desk. Marcus handled that situation very well, didn't he?" Sarah found herself drawn into conversation despite her usual preference for avoiding such interactions. Mrs. Chen had the kind of natural warmth that made evasion difficult, and there was something about her straightforward manner that felt safe. "He did," Sarah agreed, glancing at Marcus, who was watching the exchange with interest. "It could have gotten much worse if someone hadn't stepped in. My grandson has always been good in crisis situations," Mrs. Chen continued, clearly enjoying the opportunity to talk about Marcus. "Even as a little boy, he was the one other children came to when they needed help with problems." Marcus looked slightly embarrassed by his grandmother's praise, but Sarah could see that he was also pleased by her obvious affection. The interaction revealed a softer side of him that hadn't been visible during his crisis management, a vulnerability that made him seem more approachable. Mrs. Chen? The nurse appeared again, and it was time for their appointment. Marcus helped his grandmother to her feet, but before they moved toward the examination rooms, he turned to Sarah. "Would you like to get coffee sometime?" he asked, his voice casual but his expression indicating that the question was more significant than it might appear. "There's a place downtown that's usually pretty quiet." Sarah felt a moment of pure panic, her instinct to maintain isolation warring with a growing curiosity about this man who seemed to understand aspects of her reality that most people couldn't comprehend. The invitation was simple enough, but accepting it would mean stepping outside the carefully constructed boundaries that had protected her for years. "I work construction downtown," she said finally, the response coming out more like a statement of fact than an answer to his question. Marcus nodded, seemingly understanding that she needed time to consider the possibility. "So do I, actually. Different kind of construction, but I understand the schedule challenges." He paused, then added, "The coffee shop on 5th Street is open early if mornings work better for you." The specificity of the suggestion, along with his acknowledgement of the practical challenges of her work schedule, suggested that Marcus had put thought into making the invitation as low pressure as possible. Sarah realized that he was offering her multiple ways to say yes while also making it easy for her to decline if she wasn't ready. "Maybe," she said, the word coming out before she could stop herself. "I usually take breaks around 10 in the morning." It wasn't a commitment, but it wasn't a refusal either. Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his face and making him look younger and less guarded. "The coffee's good there," he said simply. "And it's usually quiet enough for conversation." As Marcus and his grandmother disappeared into the examination area, Sarah stood in the lobby for several minutes, processing what had just happened. For the first time in years, someone had invited her to spend time with them, and she hadn't immediately panicked or fabricated an excuse to avoid the interaction. The drive back to her apartment gave her time to think about the invitation and what accepting it might mean. Marcus seemed like someone who would understand if she needed to keep certain aspects of her past private, but getting to know him would also mean allowing him to see parts of herself she had kept hidden from everyone. The possibility was both terrifying and oddly appealing. Sarah had been alone with her secrets for so long that she had almost forgotten what it might feel like to have someone understand the reasons behind her guardedness, the logical basis for her hypervigilance and careful emotional control. That evening, as she sat in her apartment going through her usual routine of security checks and mental preparation for the next day, Sarah found herself actually considering the possibility of showing up at the coffee shop Marcus had mentioned. The thought scared her, but it also felt like the first stirring of something that might eventually lead to a different kind of life, one where isolation wasn't her primary strategy for safety. For the first time in years, Sarah went to sleep thinking about tomorrow's possibilities rather than yesterday's survival. Sarah stood outside Riverside Coffee on 5th Street for a full 10 minutes before finally pushing through the glass doors. She had changed her mind at least 6 times during the drive from her job site, pulling into the parking lot only to sit in her truck debating whether this was a mistake that would disrupt the careful stability she had worked years to establish. The coffee shop was exactly as Marcus had described, quiet, with comfortable seating arrangements that didn't force customers into awkward proximity, and large windows that provided good sightlines to the surrounding area. Sarah immediately appreciated the layout, noting that most of the tables offered clear views of both the entrance and the back exit, making it easy to monitor the environment while maintaining normal conversation. Marcus was already there, sitting at a corner table with a clear view of the door. He had positioned himself so that he could see the entire coffee shop while keeping his back protected, a choice that Sarah recognized from her own unconscious seating preferences. When he saw her enter, he stood and offered a small wave, his expression suggesting relief that she had actually shown up. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said as she approached the table. His honesty was refreshing after years of interactions that required careful social navigation and strategic conversation management. "Neither was I," Sarah admitted, settling into the chair across from him. The admission felt risky, but Marcus's straightforward manner seemed to invite similar honesty. They spent the first few minutes on safe topics, the quality of the coffee, the weather, general observations about the downtown construction projects they were both familiar with. Sarah learned that Marcus worked as an independent contractor specializing in security system installations for commercial buildings, a job that utilized his military expertise while allowing him the flexibility to manage his grandmother's medical appointments. 8 years in the Navy, Marcus said when Sarah asked about his background. Special operations. I got out 2 years ago when my grandmother started needing more help. His tone was matter-of-fact, neither proud nor apologetic about his service record. Sarah nodded, understanding the weight behind his simple summary. Special operations meant deployments to dangerous places, experiences that most civilians couldn't comprehend, and the kind of training that left permanent changes in how someone approached everyday situations. Construction work is good for staying busy, she offered, sharing one of the reasons she had chosen her own career path. Physical work, clear objectives, not too much sitting around thinking. Marcus smiled at that, recognizing the underlying meaning in her words. Exactly. And most construction crews don't ask a lot of personal questions as long as you can do the job. The conversation felt easier than Sarah had expected. Marcus seemed to understand the appeal of work that offered structure and purpose without requiring extensive background explanations or emotional disclosure. There was something comfortable about talking to someone who didn't need everything spelled out explicitly, who could read between the lines and understand what wasn't being said. They were on their second cups of coffee when Marcus brought up the elephant in the room. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice careful and respectful. "At the medical center, when we first saw each other, did you feel like you recognized something? Not that we'd met before, but something about the situation felt familiar?" Sarah felt her pulse quicken, but Marcus's tone wasn't threatening or demanding. He seemed genuinely curious rather than pushy, and his question suggested that he had experienced the same sense of connection she had felt. "Yes," she said simply. "You move like someone who's used to watching for trouble. Most people don't notice things the way you do." Marcus nodded slowly. "And you notice that I notice, which means you're watching for the same things." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I don't meet many people who understand why I always sit facing the door, or why I check the exits when I go somewhere new." The admission hung between them, an acknowledgement of shared experience without demanding specific details. Sarah appreciated that Marcus wasn't asking her to explain the reasons behind her own hypervigilance, just recognizing that the behaviors existed and had logical foundations. "It gets exhausting sometimes," Sarah said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "Always being ready for something bad to happen, even when you know you're probably safe." "Especially when everyone else thinks you're being paranoid," Marcus agreed. "People who've never had real reasons to be careful don't understand that some of us learn these habits for good reasons." The conversation was moving into territory that Sarah hadn't explored with anyone else. The relief of talking to someone who understood the constant background awareness, the mental energy required to function in civilian situations while maintaining tactical alertness, was greater than she had expected. "The worst part is trying to explain it to people who want to help," Sarah continued. "Therapists, doctors, well-meaning friends, they want you to let go of behaviors that they think are unhealthy, but those behaviors might be the only reason you're still alive." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his expression indicating complete understanding. "Exactly. They want you to trust that everything's fine now, that you can relax because the dangerous situation is over. But they don't understand that relaxing completely isn't really an option anymore." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. For years, she had felt like her hypervigilance and emotional guardedness were signs that she wasn't healing properly, that she was somehow failing to move past her experiences. Talking to Marcus, she began to consider that maybe these weren't symptoms of ongoing damage but rather adaptations that had served important purposes. "Can I ask what happened to you?" Marcus said gently. "You don't have to answer, but if you want to talk about it, I'm probably one of the few people who won't be shocked or try to fix you." The invitation was offered without pressure, and Sarah appreciated that Marcus had framed it as optional rather than necessary for their continued interaction. She had never told anyone the complete story of her past, had never found anyone who seemed capable of hearing it without either becoming overwhelmed or trying to minimize its significance. "I was married for 3 years," she said slowly, testing how the words felt. "To someone who turned out to be very different from who I thought he was when we met." Marcus nodded, his expression remaining carefully neutral and supportive. Sarah could see that he was making connections based on her previous comments about scars and hypervigilance, but he wasn't pushing for details she wasn't ready to provide. "It took me almost a year to get away from him," she continued. "And another 2 years of moving around before I felt safe enough to stay in one place for more than a few months." The summary was vastly simplified, leaving out the months of escalating violence, the careful planning required to escape without being tracked down, the fear that had dominated every decision for years after she had finally gotten free. But it was more than she had ever told anyone else, and Marcus's steady acceptance of her words encouraged her to continue. "I've been in this town for 3 years now, and it's the longest I've stayed anywhere since I left him. But I still check my locks twice every night and keep a baseball bat next to my bed, just in case." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing what she had shared. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but matter-of-fact. "That makes perfect sense. You learned to be careful because being careless had real consequences. Those aren't paranoid behaviors, they're survival skills." The validation was more powerful than Sarah had expected. For years, she had been told by various well-meaning people that her vigilance was excessive, that she needed to learn to trust again and let go of her defensive habits. Marcus was the first person to suggest that her behaviors were logical responses to legitimate experiences rather than symptoms that needed to be cured. "What about you?" Sarah asked, feeling that she owed him equal honesty after his acceptance of her disclosure. "Special operations covers a lot of different experiences." Marcus considered his response carefully. "Multiple deployments to places where the situation could change from routine to life-threatening very quickly. After a while, you learn to treat every situation like it might be the dangerous one, because the cost of being wrong is too high." He paused, then added, "The hardest part about coming back was realizing that most people here don't understand why I can't just turn off the alertness. They think because I'm back in a safe country, I should be able to relax completely. But my brain learned to keep me alive by never completely relaxing, and that's not something you can just decide to change." Sarah understood exactly what he meant. The mental habits that had kept them alive during dangerous periods weren't easily discarded just because the immediate threats had ended. In some ways, those habits had become part of their identities, shaping how they moved through the world and interacted with other people. "Do you think it ever gets easier?" Sarah asked. "Living with this constant awareness, managing relationships when most people don't understand why you need so much space and control?" Marcus smiled ruefully. "I don't know yet. I've been back for 2 years, and I'm still figuring it out. But talking to you today is the first time I've felt like someone really understood what I was dealing with. That feels like progress." The coffee shop had filled up during their conversation, with the lunch crowd creating a comfortable buzz of background noise that provided privacy for their increasingly personal discussion. Sarah noticed that neither of them seemed bothered by the increased activity, both automatically monitoring the new arrivals while continuing their conversation. "Would you like to do this again sometime?" Marcus asked as they prepared to leave. "I mean, just talking to someone who gets it. It doesn't have to be complicated or turn into something that makes either of us uncomfortable." Sarah appreciated his careful phrasing, the way he was offering continued connection without pressure for emotional intimacy or romantic involvement. The possibility of having someone to talk to who understood her reality was appealing, but she also recognized that any ongoing relationship would require her to be more open than she had been with anyone in years. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "But I should probably warn you that I'm not very good at normal social interactions. I tend to keep people at a distance." Marcus laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "I'm not exactly a social butterfly myself. We can figure it out as we go." They exchanged phone numbers and made tentative plans to meet again the following week. As Sarah walked back to her truck, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: anticipation for a future interaction with another person that wasn't dominated by anxiety about maintaining her protective facades. The drive back to her apartment gave her time to process the morning's conversation and its implications for her carefully structured life. Talking to Marcus had felt natural in a way that social interactions usually didn't, probably because they shared enough common experience that extensive explanations weren't necessary. For the first time since escaping her marriage, Sarah began to consider the possibility that isolation wasn't her only option for safety. Maybe there were people who could understand her need for control and space without interpreting those needs as rejection or personal failure. Maybe connection didn't have to mean vulnerability to the point of endangerment. That evening, Sarah went through her usual security routine with a different perspective. Checking her locks and positioning her defensive tools felt less like symptoms of ongoing trauma and more like reasonable precautions taken by someone who understood that safety required active maintenance. Marcus's validation of her behaviors had shifted something in how she viewed her own adaptation to her experiences. She also found herself thinking about Marcus's question about whether it got easier. Maybe the goal wasn't to become someone who could trust completely or relax entirely. Maybe the goal was to find ways of connecting with people who could accept that some level of guardedness was permanent and necessary, rather than something that needed to be overcome. For the first time in years, Sarah went to sleep thinking about someone else's well-being alongside her own, wondering how Marcus was processing their conversation and whether he was feeling the same cautious hope that had begun to stir in her own chest. The possibility of building something meaningful with someone who truly understood her reality felt both terrifying and promising. Sarah had learned not to trust easily or hope carelessly, but Marcus's presence in her life suggested that maybe some connections were worth the risk of being known.